Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Hi Helen, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Very excited to be doing another podcast.
Of course.
And this is a topic that is in my mind quite a bit at the moment. I'm doing some work next week with an organisation on this particular subject.
Okay, and this subject is the cognitive behavioural approach to coaching.
It is, yes.
So, tell me, what is the cognitive behavioural approach to coaching?
Well, much like other coaching approaches that we've explored the person-centred approach, we've explored the solution-focused approach. This one also comes from therapy. So I think most of our listeners will be familiar with the cognitive behavioural therapy approach.
CBT.
CBT.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're moving on to CBC, Cognitive Behavioural Coaching. And Cognitive Behavioural Coaching is a twin-track approach. So the first track is a behavioural approach, pretty much like the solution-focused. So it's sort of okay, what do you want to have happen? Where are you going with this? And what are your options? And how might you get there? What are the things you need to do in order to get there? So that's the behavioural approach. Mm-hmm. But in CBC, we recognise that for some people, it's not going to be that easy. There may be psychological and emotional barriers getting in the way of them taking those steps that they know they want to take in order to achieve what they want to achieve. So we're going to have that other track. So we've got the behavioural track, but we've also got the cognitive track that we might be moving along at the same time as the behavioural track. So we're trying to address some of those psychological issues that people might have.
So a thinking element.
Yes, cognitive thinking, yes.
Excellent. So what would you say are the defining elements of the cognitive behavioural approach to coaching?
So beyond the twin track approach, if we focus on the cognitive bit, because we already know about the solution focused approach of what steps you're going to take, in the cognitive element, we're going to be looking at the language people are using, because that's the most obvious way we're going to know there's something not quite sitting right for them. So there may be elements of their speech that we can pick up on that tell us that something's not quite right. So we might look for some cognitive dissonance that's going on for them.
Let's explain cognitive dissonance.
Okay, so cognitive dissonance is when you're holding two competing ideas. So it may be that you fully understand that regular exercise and eating a balanced diet are good for you and good for your health, and you want to have a healthy lifestyle, but at the same time you spend your evenings sitting watching TV, eating chocolate. And I'm
sure many can relate to that.
Yeah, so you will have some cognitive dissonance whilst that's happening, because you kind of know that in order to do what you want to do, you perhaps shouldn't be doing that, but you do it anyway. So that's some cognitive dissonance. If you had someone that understood the health risks of smoking, knew that it could lead to cancer and heart, coronary conditions, they might well know all that, but still continue to smoke every day. And I always think of John Major when I think of cognitive dissonance, because there was a time when he was Prime Minister back in the early 90s when he had this whole Back to Basics family values campaign. That was the Conservatives, his initiative. And it was all about self-discipline and respect for your family. And we found out much later that all the while that was going on, he was having an affair with one of his colleagues, Edwina Currie. And I think there must have been tremendous cognitive dissonance going on for him at that time.
Saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah, and it could be holding two competing ideas in your head, but it's generally about knowing something to be true, but then continuing to behave in a way that's not helpful.
Okay, so we're looking for cognitive dissonance, which will come across in the language the coachee uses.
We'll be looking for other unhelpful thinking patterns. So overgeneralization is something that quite often, I don't say always because that's an overgeneralization, and quite often comes up in the coaching room. So you will have coachees that might well say, oh, I could never do that, or this always happens to me, or I'm never lucky. So those are generalizations that just probably aren't true. So actually just reflecting that back to a coachee and just saying, always? Because they know it's not true. But somewhere in their head, they've got that way of thinking about it, and they're actually saying it out loud. even though they know it's not always, they start to think in that way. So we can recognise that in a coaching room when they start to use that sort of language. So overgeneralisation is one of those thinking patterns that people can get into. Applying a negative mental filter so that only the negatives of a situation are focused on. So they'll ignore all the positive. So this is perfect for maybe doing a 360 review, a multi-source feedback exercise where other people tell you what they think of you.
So that thing where some people say great stuff, other people might mention one thing that is an area of improvement, and you focus in on that, and it becomes the one thing that you can think about.
Yeah,
the one negative.
Yeah, and you'll spend weeks ruminating on it.
I don't know anyone who does that.
But it is, I've done a lot of 360 feedback in my time, and more often than not, people will focus on the one negative aspect that's come up, and there'll be some brilliant stuff said about them, but they go, I want to know who said that, because it tends to be anonymous, but they'll still want to know.
I don't think this is solely workplace focused either. I think we do this in every day in our life.
Yeah. And obviously for some people it becomes a real problem, and that's all they will focus on. They won't be able to see the positive in a situation. I'm coaching someone at the moment who does just focus on the negative, and she said, I just really struggle to see the positive. Even though in her role she knows she's doing some really good work, what she'll pick up on is one negative comment or one thing that's gone slightly wrong in the day. That's what she'll focus on. Catastrophizing is another.
Again, no one that does this.
But that just assuming the worst, when something quite trivial happens, we will just follow that through to the worst possible outcome that might be possible, but it's probably not the most likely outcome. So we'll predict, but go to a really dark place with it. So that's another one. And then just mentioned a couple of others. So the musts, the shoulds, the needs tos, the ought tos. If you've got someone that's regularly saying that in the way they talk about their situation, that can be unhelpful, because there's some sense of obligation there, and they're not necessarily moving towards something. They're doing things because they feel they ought to. And the final one I just want to mention is mind reading, and so that inaccurate, unhelpful belief that we can know what's going on in someone else's head, and we will project onto them the story that we're telling ourselves about the situation, and we go, well, they must be thinking this, when we have absolutely no idea what the other person is thinking.
That idea of, oh, that person didn't say hello to me this morning, I must have done something to offend them.
Yeah, they must be unhappy with me.
Yeah. Whereas it could have been that they're just having a tough morning, or didn't get much sleep last night or something.
So beyond those unhelpful thinking patterns, we can then end up with having some quite rigid rules or fixed thinking that can be unhelpful as well. So that could be limiting beliefs about ourselves that, well, I could never do that, or it could be beliefs or values about the way the world works that, again, get in the way of us doing what it is we want to do. So I had a lady that attended a workshop that I was running for a group of lawyers some years ago, and we were talking about these kind of rigid rules and helpful beliefs, and she had a rule that if people were late, it meant they didn't respect her. Now, obviously, in a business world, time is money, and if someone is late, you're eating into their time. But this extended into her home life. So she said that her boyfriend was frequently late. And I said, so what does it mean when your boyfriend's late? And she said, well, it means he doesn't respect me. I said, okay, so let's ignore the lateness. Let's think about him generally. To what extent do you think he does respect you? And she said, no, he's lovely, and he absolutely does. He thinks the world of me. And so I asked the question, so why have you chosen for it to be a rule that if he's late, it means he doesn't respect you? Because that is just in your head. That's not in his world. He obviously has a much more laid-back approach to life, and that's not a rule for him. So why have you chosen to make that a rule for yourself? So it was a workshop, and we didn't get to explore it much more beyond that, but I think it shows that it's possible for us to start to have rigid rules that don't really make a lot of sense, but they just become part of the fabric of our world. And it might be things that stem from childhood. We might have learnt those rules as children and followed it through. It could be our home life, it could be school, and just those rules become important to us.
So it sounds like some of these rules, some of these stories, ways of thinking, we can challenge in the coaching room and perhaps help the client to look for exceptions to those rules.
Yes, and we talked about this briefly in the solution focused approach, which was episode 8, I think. And we talked about perhaps someone saying, oh, this quite often happens to me, and we'll ask, well, tell me about a time when this doesn't happen. And I think we can apply the same thing, even though they're using absolutes and say, well, this never happens to me. We can still challenge that and say, okay, you said never. Let's just explore that. Tell me about a time when it does happen. And generally speaking, because people are overgeneralising, then they will have occasions where that rule is broken.
So the key elements that you've mentioned there help us to know when we might use this approach. And I think we mentioned in the episode on imposter syndrome that that's a good topic to use cognitive behavioural coaching with.
Yes,
so there's an example.
Yeah.
How do we go about using this approach?
Well, rather helpfully, there are some models that come from
Excellent.
the cognitive behavioural approach, and I want to share a couple with our listeners. So one is the ABCDE model, which comes from one of the founders of cognitive behavioural coaching, a chap called Albert Ellis, who was around in the 60s and 70s. And he's a strange chap in some ways, but if you ever watch videos of him, he comes across in quite a brusque manner. Certainly in terms of the way that we coach in that very person-centred way, he can seem a little bit confrontational because he's challenging people's thinking in a very strident way. So that jars a little bit when I watch him, because I think, you're kind of being a bit tough here. But anyway, his idea was that we might challenge the way people think. So he had this ABCDE model, and obviously the ABCDE stand for something, and the A stands for the activating event. So it might be that someone shows up and they tell us a story and say, well, this has happened, and then they will say, because of that, this is the way I'm thinking about it, this is the truth. And so they will have a belief around that activating event. So they will tell you what their beliefs are, they'll share that with you, and as a consequence of that, they'll tell you how they're feeling about it. So they'll say, well, I'm really angry about it and I'm going to take this all the way to the top. So they'll follow it through in that way. So they'll tell you how they're feeling, what action they're going to take or what action they're not taking, and we've got the consequence. So we've got the activating event, we've got their beliefs around the situation, and we've got the consequences of their beliefs, which might be an emotion. It might be anxiety, it might be anger, and that might be leading them either to take some action that's unhelpful, so it might be shouting at someone, or it might take them to a place of not doing something because they're too afraid, because they're anxious.
So the clients come in, have told us all of this. We can see that it's falling into that nice ABC. What's the D?
The D is dispute or debate. Well, you pay your money, you take your choice. One of those things. So we're going to challenge some of that thinking. So we'll be asking the coachee, what's the evidence for the story that you've just told me? Or using a Brené Brown expression, what's the story you're telling yourself? And I quite like to ask that question. It can seem a little confrontational at times because it is suggesting that it's a story and it's not real, but I think it's a good challenge. So what assumptions are you making? What's the evidence for this? What's the story you're telling yourself? Any one of those questions, I think, can just allow the person to pause in the story that they're telling and just to think about it. And just to sense check, is this story true? Is what I'm actually saying real, or is some of it just in my head? So we're going to explore that. We're going to ask questions around that of what the evidence is. So that's the D of the dispute. And hopefully, if we can unlock some of that thinking that they're doing about the situation, we'll get to E, which is an effective way of thinking about it.
So I know from working with clients that quite often when you do gently challenge, and with that, what's the story you're telling yourself, that's often a point of a light bulb moment where they kind of realise that they are filling in the gaps from their own experiences in the past, beliefs, values, etc. So then we get to the effective way of thinking. where perhaps we explore new ideas around.
Yeah, and as we constantly say on this podcast, we're looking at generating new thinking. So we don't want to leave them with the story they've got. If their story is unhelpful and there's not a lot of evidence for it, we want to take them to new thinking. And sometimes all you have to do is play back what they've just told you. So I was working with a senior leader in an organisation where they told me a story and told me about the way they were thinking about it and their anger around the situation. And I just played the story back and I said, sounds like your boss, who's new to the organisation, has made a mistake. And that's led to you thinking something was going to happen that wasn't going to happen because they made a mistake. And there was no ill intent, it was just a mistake. And he just paused for a moment and then went, yeah, you're right. And all of the fight that he had, all the anger he had about the situation went out of him just with me reflecting back. So it can be as simple as that, but we might want to ask questions around, what's the evidence, what's the story, what assumptions are you making?
Okay, before finding a new, more effective way of looking at it from a different perspective, perhaps.
Now, I don't explicitly use the ABCDE model with a client, so I don't tend to say, so what's the activating event? Here's a model. What's the activating event? What's your beliefs? What are the consequences of your beliefs? I will just hold that in my head and go, okay, well, we've got a story here. That's the activating event there. This is what their belief is around it. Not sure what is true in there, but they've got this belief, and this is the consequence of their belief. They're feeling angry or anxious, and their behaviours are unhelpful as well. So I think I'll hold that in my head, and then I will ask those questions. What's the story? What are your assumptions? What evidence is there for you thinking the way that you do?
So rather than rolling it out as a model, you are using it as a framework to coach around, much like Tom's Code that we've talked about in previous episodes. And the model is informing your questions to get you to the effective outcome. Yeah,
so this is where my integrative approach of starting off with a person-centred way of being, letting them tell their story, allowing them the time and space to tell their story, that's really effective. Mm-hmm. They feel heard because they've heard, I've listened to their story. But then offering that, here's a story, but some of it sounds like it might not be true, bringing in that cognitive behavioural approach of, okay, here's the activating thing, here's the belief, here's the consequence. What assumptions are you making? It's just a way of introducing it. And I'm not going to say, let me pause. I'm going to introduce a cognitive behavioural approach. I'm just going to weave it in.
So you maintain that conversation. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned there was a couple of tools. What other tools are there within cognitive behavioural?
Yes, there's another very exciting tool called the hot cross bun model.
Sounds delicious.
To be honest, the hot cross bun, it's a great pictorial representation because it looks like a hot cross bun, but actually the letters that go with the hot cross bun model aren't helpful because we can call it a space model, which gives us some letters that mean something. So in the space model, it's exactly the same model. In the space model, we have S for situation. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation that someone's facing. So we've got that as a whole. We have P for physiology. So what's going on in their body? How are they responding to this internally? What are they feeling? We have A for not emotions. A is for actions. So what actions are they taking as a result of this? And as we were saying in the earlier storytelling thing, it might be that someone is getting angry and actually shouting at someone. That could be the action. It could be that they're anxious and they're just sitting doing nothing. They're paralysed by the feelings they've got. So action is the A. The C is for cognition. So this is back to the cognitive behavioural approach. So we're using cognition. We're trying to understand what they're thinking, and they will be thinking something. And the E is for emotion. So we have space. So situation, physiology, action, cognition, and emotion. And what this model recognises is that they are all linked. So obviously the situation sits underneath everything else, but then we have their thinking. So they've done some thinking, they've told themselves a story. As a result of that, they're feeling some emotion. So it could be anxiety, it could be anger, it could be jubilation. But they've got a feeling, an emotion around it. as a result of that, they're feeling something in their body. So there's a physiological response as well. And then as a result of that, they are taking some action.
And all of these things interact together, inform each other, and also interact with the situation and can affect that situation.
Yes, so this is why the hot cross bun model is such a good pictorial representation, because if you look down on top of a hot cross bun, you can see the cross on it, the labels fit around that model. So
we'll be putting a link to that in the show notes so that people can see it.
Yeah. And also to the space model, because I think those labels are more helpful. But it is that if you can see all the lines crossed, everything connects with everything else. So if you have some emotion around something, if you're feeling really angry about it, it's probably as a result of your thinking and the physiology that you feel. And really interesting, sometimes people can get the physiology a little bit wrong. I was playing tennis the other day, and a lady that she was starting to lose, and she said, "Oh, I shouldn't have had that coffee before I started playing." She stopped off at Costa on the way, and she said, "Because coffee makes me anxious." And in my head I'm thinking, yeah, I'm not sure coffee makes you anxious. It might give you that adrenaline rush because it's a stimulant. So you might, as a result of that, then because you're about to start a tennis match, you might feel a little bit more apprehensive than you would because you've got the physiology. So that you might interpret that as, oh, I'm nervous, I'm feeling jittery.
But others
actually,
will interpret it as excited or having energy.
Yeah, just that getting readiness to play.
And I like this, it links in with very much with that embodiment work that I do, that you can, if you notice your physiology, you can change it, and then that affects how you think and how you behave and how you feel, as well as vice versa, so you can reverse engineer things.
Yes, and I think what, obviously, because this is a cognitive behavioural approach, cognition is where everything sits, really. So one of the other founders, we had Albert Ellis earlier, so he had a rational emotive behavioural therapy. That was a bit wordy. He could have worked on that a little bit. That was his approach. So we've got emotion in there. We've got the rational bit, which is the cognition, but we've got emotion in there, and we've got behavioural. Aaron Beck, who was the other founder, just had cognitive therapy. So he was very much focused on how we think about things, and how we make sense of the world is what's important. And this goes back to the Greek Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who said that people aren't troubled by events, they're troubled by their thinking about the events. So it's how we choose to think about something that causes us problems. So Aaron Beck's approach, cognitive, kind of again underpins everything. So the focus in cognitive behavioural coaching is very much on cognition, but I think there's something missing in not exploring the physiology in more depth, because I think it can make a huge difference to the way people respond to events. So just choosing to change your physiology. So if you're feeling a bit down about stuff, actually just sitting up straight and holding your head up can change the way that you start to feel about it. So it might lift your mood, and that can then start to change the way that you think about things. So I think they're all interlinked, and it doesn't matter too much where we start in trying to unpick it. So it might be that we start with the physiology and work on that, and that might then in turn change the way someone thinks and feels. But more often than not, within the cognitive behavioural approach, we're starting with the cognition and how they think about something, how they're interpreting events, and we're trying to make sure that that's evidence-based and there's some way of backing that up. And if it's not evidence-based, perhaps they can think about it differently.
So again, a model that we can use to notice what we notice as a coach, to help our clients notice what they notice about themselves, about situations. But it also sounds like the whole approach helps to give power to the individual, to help them understand themselves better, and so that going forward they can notice and change their thinking, and it helps them to become autonomous in the different situations going forward.
Yeah, and I think this is why cognitive behavioural therapy is so popular. So it's certainly popular within the NHS. A lot of millions have been spent on training up cognitive behavioural therapists, and it's widely available in the NHS. I think because it does take that quite common sense approach of moving forward and getting people to try things out, do things differently, so that they can see for themselves that by doing things in a different way, things work out differently, and that might change their thinking about it. So there's that behavioural element of it too. So if we change behaviours, maybe that will change our thinking.
It sounds like there might be some room for homework in our coaching sessions here.
Yes.
Sending our coachees out into the world to try new ways of being.
Yeah, and we might not call it homework, we might call it experimenting, but it definitely worth a try, isn't it, to experiment. And I'm coaching someone at the moment who is very much concerned with the negative thoughts that are going on for her, negative events, and really struggling to focus on the positive. So one of the things that she's going to try, and is trying, so I've seen her since she started doing this, and she's still doing it every day, she's journaling around positive events. So 3 positive things that have happened in the day, she's writing those in her journal. And what she's decided is if a negative thing, she feels compelled to write a negative thing down, that she writes 5 positive things. So she's given her that challenge that if there is something negative she feels, she has to write about it. So there's a behavioural approach that we're saying, okay, well, if you do this continuously, that might well help your mood. And this comes from positive psychology, that regular journaling can be really helpful to lift people's mood and introduce some positive emotion.
And I know we're definitely going to be talking about positive psychology and different interventions from that approach in future episodes, because it sits so nicely with coaching. Yeah,
and obviously if we take this back to cognitive behavioural therapy, then obviously there may be people with extreme conditions, so high anxiety, anger management issues, that may be not appropriate to try to resolve in the coaching room. That might be the point that we refer someone on to a therapist. But it could be that if we've got milder examples of that, so someone experiencing anxiety or anger, that we'd start to change their thinking about that and start to experiment with different ways of being. So it could be, and I know we've talked about this before, but it could be before going into an important board meeting that they go for a walk around the block. So just get rid of some of that adrenaline by taking action. Or it might be that they just don't sit down, they stand up and make sure they're the last one standing before everyone else in the room sits down. So just trying out different strategies.
Trying a power pose.
Trying a power pose.
That might boost their confidence.
Yes. So all of those things, those strategies might be something to experiment with in the cognitive behavioural approach that might be really helpful. So I think it's just recognising that all of those elements that we talked about in the space model are all interconnected, and by changing one of them we might change all of them.
And helping that client have that overview, that new perspective on the situation. This is absolutely fascinating, and I know it is a huge topic. It sounds a little bit more on the directive end of the spectrum of coaching, with the homework, if in inverted commas.
I certainly, I think in the coaching session we don't have to be directive. I think we can unpick the thinking that's going on, we can explore it all. And again, I think it's very tempting to go, okay, well, what you need to do is journaling. That's the answer. And we don't know that that's the answer. So actually exploring for the coachee. So what are your options here? What could you be doing? So like with the lady who was struggling to think of positive things. Okay, so let's imagine that you were thinking of positive things every day. How could you go about capturing those positive things that you're thinking about? Because positive thoughts are probably going to come into your head. So just a more an exploration of what's possible, rather than saying, okay, you need to go away and you need to do some journaling every day for the next 3 weeks. I'm not going to be that directive, but it might be that between you can co-create that way forward, so that they do go away with some experimentation to try things out and see how it changes things.
I know I've worked with someone recently who we had a conversation about what had worked for them in the past, and they said, well, I remember when I was writing a gratitude journal every evening, I felt better. So we talked about how they might play with that for a while and see if that improves their situation. So
we talked about this in the solution focused approach, didn't we? Very much, okay, what's worked for you in the past?
Yes.
Tell me about a time when you've done this successfully. What was working for you then?
So it sounds like, although it's an approach on its own, there is some integration there already. We can see some crossover, as we often can with other approaches to coaching.
And they all sort of emerged at the same time. So the person-centered approach, Carl Rogers was around working in the 60s and 70s. Albert Ellis, Aaron Beck were really getting started in the 60s and the 70s, and the solution-focused approach emerged in the 1970s. So all coming at a similar time, and obviously all reading each other's material and taking influence from that. So yeah, I'm not surprised that there is some crossover, and it's just, I think cognitive behavioural, that approach offers something that perhaps is missing in the person-centred approach and the solution-focused approach. I think the solution-focused approach can focus on the positive. Okay, what's worked well for you in the past? What could you be doing? And what strengths do you have? So very much drawing out that positive side of things. The cognitive behavioural is really, okay, if that fails, what do we do next? Because actually there's something getting in the way. And what is that something? And it's probably some unhelpful thinking. So it's then unpicking the unhelpful thinking.
And there's that different perspective, isn't there? And empowering the individual to see things differently. I love this approach. I think it's fantastic. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on it. And I'm sure we're going to return to some of the concepts within it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there is more to uncover within
Yes.
the cognitive behavioural approach. So maybe a future episode. But no, I've really enjoyed talking about that this morning. So
Me
thank
too.
you, Helen.
Thank you.
And next time we will be interviewing a coaching doctor.
Yes.
So we will tell you all about that next time. But for now, we will say goodbye and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.